challenger in the Ford Mustang 77 and
Dan Gurney did not hate drivers the way people imagine, but in Formula One, there were competitors who created something very close to it because they didn't just challenge him, they took control away from him. Gurney was a driver who built races on structure, on rhythm, on understanding how a race would evolve over distance, but certain drivers disrupted that completely, not with reckless moves, but with precision and intelligence. They forced him out of his plan without making it obvious, corner after corner, lap after lap, until the race no longer belonged to him. That was the problem. These were drivers who didn't chase the race, they reshaped it, who didn't react, they anticipated. And once Gurney was forced into reacting, instead of controlling, the advantage was gone. That is where the real tension came from, and that is what defined the drivers he respected and quietly, deeply could not stand. And the first driver he wants to talk about is Phil Hill. And for Dan Gurney, this was never about aggression or dominance in the obvious sense. It was about a kind of control that didn't announce itself, a presence that stayed quiet but constantly interfered with the structure of a race. Gurney was a driver who relied on building a race step by step, establishing rhythm early, understanding tire behavior, managing distance, and gradually placing himself in a position where he dictated what happened next. But Phil Hill disrupted that process without ever appearing to attack it directly. That was the problem, because Hill did not force mistakes in the traditional way. He didn't pressure you into a bad corner or a rushed move. Instead, he stayed consistent in a way that removed your ability to stretch the race in your favor. And over time, that consistency became a form of pressure that was difficult to respond to. There were races, especially during the early 1960s, when both drivers were active at a high level, where Gurney would enter with a clear plan, understanding exactly how the pace should evolve across the race distance. But with Phil, Hill involved that plan started to lose clarity as the laps progressed. Hill had a way of maintaining proximity without overcommitting, which meant that Gurney could not break away without taking unnecessary risks, and at the same time, he could not relax into a controlled rhythm because Hill was always within reach, always positioned in a way that limited options. This created a situation where every decision became heavier, every adjustment felt more significant, and that is exactly the kind of environment Gurney tried to avoid, because once a driver starts overthinking instead of executing, control begins to slip. What made Phil Hill even more difficult to deal with was his ability to read the race without forcing it into chaos. He did not disrupt through unpredictability, he disrupted through understanding, and that meant there was no clear weakness to target. Gurney could not rely on waiting for an error because Hill rarely gave one, and he could not rely on pushing the pace aggressively because Hill would simply adapt without losing position. That balance forced Gurney into a narrow space where neither approach gave a clear advantage, and in Formula One, that kind of limitation is one of the most frustrating situations a driver can face. Over time, this dynamic created a quiet but persistent tension, not built on rivalry in the emotional sense, but on a professional recognition that Phil Hill represented a type of opponent who made control extremely difficult to maintain. Gurney understood speed, he understood pressure, but what Phil Hill brought into a race was something more subtle, a steady presence that reshaped the flow of competition without ever making a dramatic statement. And that is exactly why he stood out on this list. Because for Dan Gurney, the drivers he could not stand were not always the fastest or the most aggressive, but the ones who made his control disappear without giving him a clear moment to take it back. The next driver he wants to mention is Graham Hill, and unlike Phil Hill, this was not a quiet kind of pressure. This was something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and for Dan Gurney, that made it even harder to deal with because Graham Hill did not just exist within the race, he actively shaped it around the moments that mattered most. Gurney understood rhythm, he understood how to build a race across distance, but Graham Hill had a different approach. He didn't need to control every lap, he only needed to control the right ones, and that difference changed everything. There were races throughout the 1960s where Gurney would establish a strong position early, managing pace, keeping the car balanced, waiting for the race to unfold naturally. But Graham Hill had a way of staying just outside that control, never fully committing, never fully dropping back, always placing himself in a position where he could intervene at exactly the wrong moment for his competitors. That timing was what made him dangerous because it meant Gurney could not rely on a predictable structure. He could not settle into a rhythm, knowing that the race would progress the way he intended because Graham Hill would disrupt it at the point where it mattered most. What made this even more frustrating was that Graham Hill was not simply reacting, he was anticipating. He understood when drivers like Gurney would begin to push, when they would conserve, when they were preparing to make a move, and instead of responding after the fact, he positioned himself before it even happened. That meant Gurney often found himself making decisions under pressure that did not come from obvious threats, but from a growing awareness that Graham Hill was already one step ahead in the sequence of the race. In Formula One, that kind of anticipation forces a driver out of instinct and into reaction, and once that shift happens, control is already lost. Gurney experienced this in multiple competitive situations, particularly in races where strategy and timing played a greater role than outright speed because that was where Graham Hill was at his strongest. He could manage a race without dominating it, he could stay within reach without exposing himself, and then when the opportunity appeared, he would act with precision, not hesitation. That ability to wait, to calculate, and then to strike at the exact moment created a kind of pressure that built over time, not explosive but constant, and for a driver like Gurney, that was one of the most difficult dynamics to handle. The issue was not that Graham Hill overwhelmed him with pace, it was that he disrupted the decision-making process itself. Gurney could not commit fully to his strategy, because there was always the risk that Graham Hill had already accounted for it, already positioned himself to counter it, and that uncertainty forced hesitation. In racing, hesitation is enough to change the outcome, and Graham Hill knew how to create it without making it obvious. That is why he stands in this position on the list, because for Dan Gurney, the drivers who were hardest to deal with were not the ones who attacked relentlessly, but the ones who made every decision feel uncertain, and Graham Hill did exactly that, not by overpowering the race, but by controlling the moments that defined it. The next driver he wants to mention is Jim Clark. And for Dan Gurney, this was a completely different kind of problem, because with Clark, there was no visible struggle, no buildup of pressure, no clear point where the race shifted, it simply moved away from you without warning. Gurney was used to understanding where a race could be influenced, where time could be gained, where an opponent might begin to lose grip on the situation, but Jim Clark removed those reference points entirely, and that is what made him so difficult to deal with. There were races in the early and mid-1960s where Gurney entered with a clear structure, knowing how he wanted to manage the distance, how to position the car, how to control the pace relative to the field, but with Clark involved, that structure started to lose meaning very quickly. Clark did not need to fight for control in the traditional sense. He did not need to pressure or force situations. He simply drove at a level of precision and efficiency that made the race unfold differently around him. Gurney could execute his plan perfectly and still find himself losing ground, not because of a mistake, but because Clark operated on a level that did not require disruption to gain advantage. What made this especially frustrating was that Clark gave nothing away. There were no clear weaknesses, no visible signs of strain, no moments where Gurney could identify an opportunity to apply pressure. In most racing situations, even the strongest drivers show something over distance, a small inconsistency, a moment of hesitation, a slight drop in pace, but Clark remained stable in a way that removed those openings entirely. That forced Gurney into a position where he had to consider pushing beyond his own limits just to stay within reach, and that is where the real tension began. Gurney understood that pushing beyond the natural rhythm of the car often led to mistakes, but against Clark, staying within that rhythm was not enough. That created a conflict that few drivers could handle comfortably because it meant choosing between controlled performance and necessary risk, and neither option guaranteed success. Clark did not force that decision directly. He created it through consistency, through precision, through a level of control that made every other approach feel insufficient. There were specific races, particularly in circuits where balance and smoothness were critical, where Clark's advantage became even more pronounced because he could maintain speed without stressing the car, without overdriving, without creating instability. Gurney would find himself working harder for the same result, managing tires, adjusting lines, making small corrections, while Clark appeared to operate with less effort but greater effect. That difference was not just technical, it was psychological because it made the entire race feel out of reach even when it was still within distance. Over time, this created a unique kind of frustration, not built on rivalry in the aggressive sense, but on a recognition that Clark represented a level of performance that could not be easily challenged. Gurney could not disrupt him, could not pressure him into mistakes, could not reshape the race around him, and that removed one of the most important tools a driver relies on. In Formula One, being unable to influence the race is one of the most difficult situations to accept, and Jim Clark embodied that challenge more than almost anyone else. That is why he stands here on the list, because for Dan Gurney, the drivers he could not stand were not always the ones who fought the hardest, but the ones who made the fight feel unnecessary. And Jim Clark did exactly that. He turned competition into inevitability, and that is something no driver ever wants to face. The next driver he wants to mention is Jack Brabham, and for Dan Gurney, this was where things became deeply uncomfortable, because Brabham was not just a driver on the track, he was thinking about the race in the same way Gurney was sometimes. Even earlier, sometimes even more clearly, and that created a kind of conflict that went beyond pace or positioning. Gurney built his races on understanding, on structure, on reading how everything would develop over distance, but with Brabham, that advantage no longer existed because he was facing someone who approached the race with the same mindset. There were races where Gurney expected to control the flow through careful planning, managing tire wear, balancing pace, choosing the right moments to push, but Brabham disrupted that, not by reacting but by preempting. He would make adjustments before the situation fully developed. He would shift pace at moments where most drivers would wait, and that forced Gurney into a position where his own decisions started to feel late, even when they were technically correct. That difference is critical in Formula One because timing defines control, and when another driver is consistently ahead of that timing, control begins to slip away. What made Brabham particularly difficult to deal with was his dual perspective. He understood the car as a driver and as a builder, and that gave him a deeper connection to how the race would evolve mechanically over distance. Gurney was one of the few drivers who also operated with that level of awareness, which is exactly why this matchup became so tense, because neither driver was relying purely on instinct. Both were thinking, calculating, adjusting, and that created a race within the race, one that was not always visible from the outside. In certain races during the mid-1960s, especially when Brabham was running his own team, this dynamic became even more pronounced because he was not just adapting to the race, he was shaping it through decisions made long before the lights went out. Gurney would find himself in situations where the expected behavior of the car, the expected progression of tire performance, the expected rhythm of the race did not align with what was actually happening, and that misalignment forced constant adjustment. That is exactly what a driver like Gurney tried to avoid, because the more adjustments you are forced to make, the less control you retain. Brabham did not need to dominate every lap. He only needed to disrupt the structure that others depended on. And once that structure was gone, the race became something different, something less predictable, something harder to manage. Gurney could not rely on building an advantage over time because Brabham would interfere with that process before it fully developed, and that created a constant pressure that came not from speed but from understanding. What made this even more frustrating was that there was no simple solution. Against most drivers, Gurney could adjust his approach, push harder, conserve more change lines, alter strategy, but against Brabham, those adjustments were often anticipated, countered, or neutralized before they could have a real effect. That meant Gurney was not just racing against the car or the track, he was racing against a mind that operated on the same level. And in Formula One, that is one of the most difficult situations a driver can face. That is why Jack Brabham stands at this position on the list, because for Dan Gurney, the drivers he could not stand were not simply the fastest or the most aggressive, but the ones who understood the race in the same language and then used that understanding to take control away from him before he even had the chance to establish it. And the last driver he wants to talk about, and the one Dan Gurney hated the most, is Jackie Stewart. Because this was not just about control being challenged, this was about control being taken away completely in a way that felt calculated, precise, and impossible to reverse once it began. Gurney understood how to build a race, how to shape it over distance, how to stay ahead of the moment, but Stewart operated in a way that made those strengths less effective, not by overpowering them, but by neutralizing them before they could take hold. There were races in the late 1960s where this became very clear, especially as Stewart developed into one of the most complete drivers on the grid, combining precision, intelligence, and consistency in a way that forced everyone around him into a different kind of race. Gurney would approach a race with structure, with a plan built on timing and control, but Stewart would dismantle that structure piece by piece, not with aggressive moves, not with unnecessary risks, but with an understanding of exactly when to apply pressure and when to remove it. That balance is what made him so difficult to deal with, because it meant Gurney could never fully settle into his own rhythm. Stewart had a way of controlling the pace without appearing to do so, adjusting his speed just enough to keep other drivers within reach, while never allowing them to take the initiative. Gurney would find himself in situations where pushing harder did not create separation, and holding position only reinforced Stewart's control over the race. That is where the frustration came from, because every option felt limited, every decision felt anticipated, and once a driver begins to feel that the race is no longer under his command. What made Stewart stand above the others on this list was his ability to combine technical precision with psychological pressure. He did not just drive the car efficiently, he controlled the environment around him, forcing other drivers into reacting rather than acting. Gurney was used to being the one who dictated the race, the one who set the pace and forced others to adjust, but against Stewart, that role was reversed, and that reversal was difficult to overcome. There were moments where Gurney could match the pace, moments where he could stay within range, but staying close was not enough because Stewart rarely made the kind of mistake that allowed a race to be taken back. That meant the window for control never fully opened, and over the course of a race, that absence of opportunity became the defining factor. Gurney was not being beaten in a conventional sense. He was being contained, managed, and gradually removed from influence. In Formula One, that is one of the most difficult realities a driver can face, because the sport is built on control, on the belief that if you execute correctly, you can shape the outcome. But Stewart challenged that belief by operating at a level where execution alone was not enough. He forced Gurney into a position where even a well-driven race could still fall short, and that is what made him stand apart from the rest. That is why Jackie Stewart is at the top of this list, because for Dan Gurney, the drivers he could not stand were not simply the fastest or the smartest, but the ones who made control feel impossible. And Stewart did exactly that. He took race away without ever needing to chase it, and in doing so, he defined the kind of opponent Gurney respected the most and could never fully accept. For Dan Gurney, these names were never about emotion, never about personal conflict, and never about anything outside the car, because in Formula One, hate does not come from personality, it comes from control, and every driver on this list represents a moment where control was taken away from him in a way he could not easily recover. Phil Hill removed it through consistency, Graham Hill disrupted it through timing, Jim Clark made it irrelevant through precision, Jack Brabham challenged it through understanding, and Jackie Stewart took it completely through control of the race itself. What connects all of them is not speed alone, but the ability to reshape how a race unfolds, to force another driver out of his structure and into reaction. And for someone like Gurney, that was the defining line. Because once a driver stops leading the race and starts responding to it, the advantage is gone and the race belongs to someone else. That is the reality of Formula One at its highest level. It is not about who drives faster in a straight line. It is about who controls the space, the timing, the decisions, and the pressure over distance. And the drivers on this list did exactly that. They did not just compete with Dan Gurney, they forced him into races that no longer followed his rules. So the question becomes simple when control is the only thing that matters. What happens when you face drivers who take it away from you before you even realize it is gone?